Today's talk is called It's All in Your Imagination, and what does it mean to be not to be able to imagine, or even what it means to imagine. So I'm just waiting for one final okay. Yep. Okay. I've been told that you can see me. Great. Now, all the kit. Before I start, just a bit of a housekeeping. The first is that as you're watching on Facebook, could you like the page? That will be useful for us for the future. And any comments that you have and conversations that you want to have with other people on there, please feel free. And most importantly, questions. So at the end of the talk, I don't know how long this will take because it's the first time I'm ever talking about this topic. So I'm a bit nervous about it. I hope that I'll be talking for about 45 to 50 minutes. At the end of it, I'll take a little pee break, and my team of helpers, the ones who I've been getting little messages from about whether you can hear me, etc., they will be harvesting all the questions from the Facebook chat, and they'll be sending them to me. And I will try to reply to them in a chronological order, so the way that the questions come into me. So please feel free to send in your questions, but they will be answered at the end rather than as soon as you send them in. If you're a tweeting person, then I'd really appreciate you tweeting about this and hashtag me if possible. For some of you, this is not your first talk, and I know I've even got some super fans, including Jane, who I'm sure will be very pleased to hear me say her name. But for some others, this is your first talk, and if it is, then welcome. This is, as I said, series 3 of my talks. I did 2 series, one in spring and summer last year, and then another one in autumn. We mount and upload all of the videos from the talks onto YouTube rather. And if you go to my YouTube channel, so if you YouTube Dr. Ashok Ansari Neuro Talks, you will find my channel, and there's a specific playlist for my online talks. So please do subscribe to that. It's completely free, and you'll get edited versions of the talks and the questions afterwards. So you can hear about the other talks I've given in the past. One thing I really love about my talks, weirdly because of the pandemic, is that I've got a bigger reach, because I was going to give talks like this in person, which I do anyway, in different types of venues, pubs, restaurants, organizations like Rotary clubs or schools, or organizations that work with people with head injuries. So I do public engagement anyway, but that requires someone to be in the same physical space as me. But the lockdown and etc. has given me the opportunity to reach out to people who are further afield. So I've tried to say welcome in as many languages as I think are represented in my audience. If your particular country isn't represented here, then please do email me or my team, and we will make sure that for future talks you are included in here. So welcome to you all. It would be nice to see what the most obscure country is that someone comes from. So welcome to all my friends around the world who are listening in. I always start my talks with my thanks and gratitude to my team. And that's because it's really important for me that the audience realizes that this is a team effort. I'm really just the monkey at the front who's doing the singing and dancing, but the work has been done by people who have helped me so much on the technical side, on the resources side, getting information for me. And these people include Lofty, who's in the top left-hand corner there, and Oscar. They're my 2 tech guys, and they're invaluable. And then there's a group of young ladies who've been fantastic for helping me. Lucy, I'm sorry that I don't have a photograph of you on here. I couldn't find one, but there will be one for the next one. So thank you to going from left to right, Andrea, Claudia, Priyanka, and Kim. I would like to actually point out particularly Claudia, second from left, who is the one who's encouraged me particularly with this Aphantasia talk, and who has become my right-hand person, and she is part of my research team and will be leading with the work that we're going to be doing. So thank you to these people. They're the ones who've made this all happen. As an overview of the talk, I'm going to talk about what is a mental image, what does that actually mean, and then give you a historical overview, because science proceeds by someone saying something, someone else expanding on that or disagreeing, and then someone else giving an opinion, and we keep refining our ideas. So I always try to show students that we've come to here today on the shoulders of other people and what they've helped us see. Then I'm going to talk about how some people unfortunately lose these mental images through brain damage, because that is one of the way that this condition came to public knowledge, because of a patient with brain damage. And I'll be showing you one of my patients. But then I'll show you that it's possible for people to lack visual mental images, but with no brain damage. And so we have some people, like the patient that you'll see some videos of, who used to be able to mentally image, see in their mind's eye, as I'll explain, but now cannot. But then there are other people who've never had that ability. And I'm going to draw a distinction between those and try to see what that can tell us about mental imagery. Then I want to talk a tiny bit about individual differences and a new taxonomy, because this field is so new that the terms that we're using are good for what we know at the moment. But every time we make a new discovery, we realize that we need to expand our knowledge and maybe even our terminology. So I'm going to suggest a new taxonomy. And then finally, I'll tell you what ART, which stands for Ashok's research team, which is my research laboratory, is doing with aphantasia work. And if anyone is interested, then we're looking for people who have aphantasia or any other conditions, including prosopagnosia, agnosia, synesthesia, etc. So more about that later. Okay. This all starts with sensory experience. So sensory experience is the way we interact with the world. We have our five senses of our vision, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. So experiences come in by these five senses, and we somehow put that together. And we experience that moment. So the moment that I'm experiencing right now, I can see the screen, I can even hear my own voice. I've got a bit of taste of the chocolate that I ate just before I started the talk, and I can feel the chair on my bum. So I can feel all these things. That's the sensory experience of the moment. Now, a lot of us also have a bit of a sensory experience, but I think it's important to note that it's a different sensory experience when we remember things. So this photograph is from about 50 weeks ago. It was taken in New York because I'd just been to a conference in Denver, and I was passing through New York, and it happened to be my birthday. And the gentleman on the left-hand side is my amazing friend, Bill Hurst, who lives in New York and is a psychology professor. And he took me out for dinner, and you see my very elaborate birthday cake there. Now, I can see that photograph. It reminds me of that amazing experience. You can see the wine there, etc. Bill probably tried to sing happy birthday to me, etc., etc. So that is my memory of this event. Now, if I was to take that away from you, so ignore this image for now, you if you don't have a problem with visual mental imagery, can probably recreate some of that image. So what's happening there when you recreate that visual image? Now, that's a very complex idea. What happens? Is it just a faded version of the photograph that you took in your mind's eye, or is it something else? It's very complex, and it's been challenging neuroscientists for many years. Now, the man that I worked for my postdoctoral fellowship, Antonio Damasio, is a really important thinker in this field. And what he suggested is that when we remember something, what we're doing is kind of recreating the original event. Now, in this diagram of a brain where you're looking side on, with the green part at the front being the front of the head and the red part at the back being the back of the head. Now, what he suggests is that information comes in through our five senses, and here I've shown where that information comes in for three of the senses. For the auditory sense, so the auditory cortex in the lime green, through vision and our eyes, it goes to the back of the head, to the visual cortex, and then the primary sensory cortex, which is the blue strip, which is like an Alice band that goes across the head like this, which brings in information from what we're feeling in terms of our bodily sensations. And what Damasio said is that when we experience an event, what the brain is doing is bringing together these different senses, the sound of what you're seeing, the sight of what you're seeing, the sound of what you're experiencing, the sight of what you're experiencing, and the physical feeling, and then also by extension, the smell and the taste of what you're experiencing. Now, as you can see, these things are happening in three quite different areas of the brain. And what he said is that the brain creates a little conjunction between these, and it stores that as your memory. And when you try to remember that event, so looking at that photograph of my little birthday party, what you're doing is you're finding that little combination and you're trying to replay parts of what's there. And the correspondence between how good your little combination of information is with the original information allows you to have either a very clear memory or a weak memory. So going back, that's what the image is like. Now, some of you won't have remembered much of the details on this. Some of you will have remembered a lot of detail on this. Now, that is down to individual differences, because some people are exceptionally good with remembering sensory information, and some people are not. Now, what we're trying to work out is what is the reason for this, for that memory difference. But then beyond that, we've also got the fact that we can imagine things that aren't present. So if I asked you to close your eyes and not remember anything, but to think about walking along a beach with gentle waves crashing away and the palm trees swaying, and feel the warmth of the sand on your feet, etc., etc. Even though you aren't thinking of a particular event, you might be able to create that image in your head. And so mental imagery is slightly different from this sensory re-experiencing. It is a creation of something that isn't present. And that is one of the things that cognitive psychologists are trying to understand. And what this talk is about is the fact that that exists, that we can create these mental images. But then the fact that there are some people who have difficulty with that. And what does that tell us about how those images are created, why they're important, whether there is a detriment to not being able to create those images, and whether there might even be advantages to that. So it's very complex. And the thing that I'd like to say right at the outset is that we're only like a baby crawling in the dark in our understanding of this. So for example, the area that Claudia will be doing her PhD with me on is prosopagnosia, which is face recognition disorder. Face recognition disorders are very rare. And so when Claudia did a literature search for the number of papers that have been published on patients with acquired prosopagnosia, so not developmental prosopagnosia, this is people who used to be able to recognize faces, but who can no longer recognize faces because of very specific brain damage, she could only find about 10 papers ever published. And overall, she's managed to find about, I think, about 60 papers or so on prosopagnosia, which include papers on developmental prosopagnosia, where people have always had the problem with recognizing faces. Now, the reason I say this is because prosopagnosia is very rare, as I said, especially the acquired version is, and Claudia could find 60 papers. So far, I think there have been 12 papers in total on any form of aphantasia. So at the moment, we're explorers that are really just mapping the territory. We don't really know much. We're just kind of saying, this is what we're finding. And then if enough of us add up our findings, then we'll start getting to a theoretical level. Okay, so I said that I like giving you a historical overview. The ancient Greeks were thinking about it, so I haven't talked about them here, but Plato felt that something in the mind's eye actually is not really that important. The thought is the more important thing, whereas Aristotle thought that these thoughts were the mental images were the most important thing. And we'll see how that plays out in terms of what we're finding. In terms of more modern thinking, first of all, this started in the 19th century, the late 19th century. And the first person to talk about this was Sir Francis Galton, who was actually Charles Darwin's cousin. He's got a bit of a shady past, because I think he talked about eugenics at one point, but he was an intelligent man, and he started up a number of lines of inquiry, which we're still discovering today. So, for example, synesthesia, which is something that I'll talk about later, was something that Galton talked about in the late 1800s. But he also talked about mental imagery and how some people are better than others at seeing something in their mind's eye. And in a very typically English way, his test involved seeing what's on the breakfast table. So he asked people to imagine what was on their breakfast table and to rate how clear their images were. And from that, he could give people ratings of high imagery versus low imagery. So Galton started the trend. Then a psychiatrist in France, Cotard, talked about mental images as well. And he talked about it more from a psychiatric perspective, because he felt that maybe there was a link between the ability to have or have not, or not have mental images and some psychiatric conditions. But then Charcot, who is apparently one of the fathers of modern neurology, he is the person who said, actually, this is to do with damage to the brain. So rather than a psychological issue or psychiatric issue, as Cotard was suggesting, Charcot was saying, I think this is due to damage in the brain. So he was moving things on. And then bringing us into the 20th century, this is Alan Pavia, who is an American. And with the birth of cognitive psychology, which is us able to have a language for understanding the way that the brain processes information, he came up with something known as the dual coding hypothesis, and we'll see why that's important. Pavia suggested that depending on how visually imaginable something was, we could end up with two different ways of processing that information. The details of this are not important. The main thing is that we can have what are called non-verbal stimuli. So a telephone, my glass of water, etc. So there isn't any verbal information here, but the glass exists. And then we've got verbal information. So I can say telephone. You hear the word telephone, and I can say the word water glass. What Pavia suggested is that there are links that happen between our the sound of a word and the image of a word, and that's rather important in storing information. And the reason that that's important is because it can make some things more memorable. So, for example, the word glass, water glass, you've got at least two different ways of laying down some sort of code for it. You've got the vision of it, and you've got the sound of the word. But a more abstract word like peace or harmony, it's more difficult to have a visual image of that. So you only have the verbal code for it. And research has shown that that does mean that words like that are abstract in nature, such as harmony, hope, etc., tend to be less memorable than the more concrete words, which you can think of visually and verbally. Now, there was a big debate in the 70s and earlier about whether these images that are in here, in this mind's eye, whatever we want to call it, whether they're real or not. And Stephen Koslin did a rather intriguing experiment. What he did was he got people to imagine this island, to look at this island and think about it, and then keep drawing it until they had a really good drawing of it in their mind's eye. Then you took the drawing away, and he asked them questions about this island. So how long would it take to get from the tree that's in the southwest to that little peninsula that's on the eastern side? And what he did was he gave directions or movements that involved different amounts of traveling. So going from the tree in the southwest to the hut that's also in the southwest should take not much time, and going from the tree to the volcano at the top should take longer. And so what he did was he asked people to now imagine, so with their eyes closed, this island, and he asked them to walk across and say when they had got there. And what he found was that the physical distance between locations resulted in more time to scan and get to that point in the island, as if someone was creating this image in their mind's eye and actually walking across it. So this gave a suggestion that what Pavia talked about this visual code that we create and which we can somehow inspect in our mind's eye has got a reality, because otherwise you wouldn't get longer time to walk across the island for getting to a place that was further away. So the main point about this is that there has been debate about what is it that we see when we close our eyes. As I showed you earlier with the photograph from my birthday party, are you actually seeing that again, or are you making it up? What's happening? So that was the big debate at the time. And it hasn't been completely resolved, but nonetheless, there is a debate. Now we move to Great Britain, and these two men who are like the grandfathers of cognitive psychology in the country. On the left-hand side is Professor Alan Baddeley, who is kind of like the equivalent of David Attenborough in cognitive psychology. He's like the grandfather and Graham Hitch, who was actually his PhD student, but the two men created what's known as the working memory model. And I'm extremely proud to say that it happened about 5 miles from where I'm sitting, because this happened at Sussex University in the 1960s when these two men worked there. And this is a model of memory about how our short-term memory works. That is, everyone in the world knows it, and every student will learn about this model. And it's fantastic, given that these two men are such wonderful people. The details aren't important, but the way that this model works is that you've got a verbal part of it, which is known as the phonological loop, and we don't need to care about any of that. But there's also a visual part of it known as the visuospatial sketchpad. And this is where information comes into our eyes physically. Now, importantly, that model and studies that have been done with different types of experiments have actually shown that the visual aspect and the spatial aspect of our information in our mind's eye are actually separate. And that does sound completely bonkers, but the results suggest that your understanding of where something is, which is spatial, is actually separate from your visual information of that same information. So if the tree is in the top left-hand corner, then your spatial awareness or understanding of that tree being in the top left is actually separate from your visual information of the tree itself. Now, that just seems so counterintuitive. Why, if it's one object in one place, why would they be separate? Now, this is important because, as we'll see later on, those things can actually separate even in aphantasia. Finally, we come to this other lovely man who's also British, and this is the neurologist, Professor Adam Zemanu, who I know is a really nice guy. And he came onto this scene because as a neurologist, he was referred a patient while he was working in Edinburgh who'd had surgery for an angioplasty in 2002. So a heart-related condition, but because of a complication to do with that, unfortunately, this patient, who is known in the literature as MX, lost the ability to mentally visualize. So when he was thinking about his children or his grandchildren, he couldn't bring their images to his mind's eye. And if any of you have got children, or you're thinking about your family members, etc., and you close your eyes, you do have some sort of image of them. And MX didn't have this. He used to have it, but now, following brain damage, he couldn't see this. And it was the first time that Adam had come across this type of issue. So he started looking in the literature, and that's when he found out that Galton and Charcot, Cotard, etc., had talked about these possible conditions. So he knew that there was a reality to it. Now, following some work in 2015, which I'll tell you about in a little while, Adam coined the term aphantasia, and this is defined as the inability to form mental images of objects that are not present. So it's like me saying, think of a horse, and presumably you don't have a horse in your living room while you're watching this. So if you think of a horse in your mind's eye, then you're creating a mental image of that horse, even though it's not present. So that was termed in 2015, and it's when one of the first ever scientific papers came out in this field. So generally speaking, without going into the theoretical side of things, what do we use these mental images for? Why? One thing is that we use them for communicating information to other people. For example, if you're giving directions to someone, you do give them visual information about what to look out for, when to turn left, etc. Or if you're telling them about how to find something in your house, you would use some forms of visual information about where to find things. We also use it in reading. So we often have those reviews of books that are so evocative in the creation of these images of the scenes that the author is talking about. We use it very much for autobiographical memory. And an example was me telling you about my birthday party. I can remember that event. I didn't need that photograph. I could remember it, and I can remember other birthday parties I've had as well. And we'll see why that's relevant in a moment. Another thing is dreaming. Now, one wouldn't have thought that this mental imagery is important for dreaming, but it turns out that it is. So what I'm going to try to do now is to give you a flavor for some of this through, finally, future thinking. Now, future thinking is you thinking about what you're going to be doing when this bloody lockdown is over, and the first pub visit or the first meal or the first time you get to see your loved ones that you haven't seen for a while, first holiday, etc. And future thinking involves, for at least for a number of us, creating a mental image. So some of you know that I'm a real Italiophile, and I go to Venice to visit a wonderful family I know. So I'm already thinking about the hugs I'm going to give them when I arrive there. And I'm feeling that in my body when I think about hugging Paola and Alessandro, etc. So mental imagery and that playing of information, sensory information in our body seems to be important for this future thinking. My interest in this area came about rather obliquely because, as some of you know, I work in the field of prosopagnosia, which is difficulty in recognizing faces. Because of a newspaper article that I was involved in, I got contacted by a lady who was rather intriguing, because this lady can't recognize faces, and yet her career is as a portrait painter. And this is Barbara's painting, a self-portrait of herself. And it's knowing Barbara, this is an accurate self-portrait. Now, the amazing thing is that Barbara can do these beautiful paintings, which are very veridical, but she can't do it without the person there. So she has to take a Polaroid or a photograph of some description of the person, because she can't do everything in one sitting. And whereas a lot of painters will do a first sit with their subject and then fill in their details from their memory, Barbara's unable to do that. So Barbara is this very intriguing case of someone who has difficulty recognizing faces, can't seem to keep that mental image in her mind's eye, and yet has ended up specializing in painting faces. And so that was the first time I became aware of this, and so it piqued my interest. The next thing that happened, and this was actually about the same time that Adam started his work, and I think that Adam and I talked about this about 6 or 7 years ago, because I met David in about 2014. And David had, just like MX, Adam's patient, had a heart-related condition. David had unfortunately suffered a heart attack. He'd had to be shocked back to life, and thankfully they succeeded. But because of the interruption of blood to his brain, he suffered some brain damage. Now, I got to know David because of his prosopagnosia, because unfortunately David is now left without the ability to recognize faces. He can't recognize his daughters, his wife, people on TV. He can't even recognize himself. So there are stories he's told me about walking towards someone and trying to say to the other person, no, you go first, and you go first. And it turns out that he was talking to himself in a mirror. So that was David's, the primary condition that I was looking into. But he also told me about his inability to see once he closed his eyes. Now, I should have said my thanks to David as well at the start, because David is an extremely wonderful man who's been really generous to my research team, and actually even to other people with prosopagnosia by being willing to talk to them. And some of you will have seen the last lockdown talk I did, which was in December. If you didn't, then I would highly recommend watching that when I've uploaded it, because I talk a bit about prosopagnosia, but more importantly, I then interview David and you hear it from his own words. Now, I just got this video yesterday. It's David telling me about, first of all, what he felt his mental imagery was like before his brain damage. Now, because David's in front of a clever green screen, every now and then you'll see things appearing on his shoulder, and that's not magic, it's just the green screen. So I hope this works well. I'm just going to make sure that everything is in. Okay.
I would say it was excellent, or to the point of exceptional sounds a bit grandiose, but it was very good. I had I work in architecture and design, and I could handle very complicated shapes and forms and images and that kind of thing in my mind very, very simply. So I could look at an object or some objects, and there would be a three-dimensional problem, and I could sort it out in my head. Was that
okay? Now, because of the wonders of technology, I can't actually hear what David is saying, because there's something about me playing the sound to you and not being able to hear it myself. But I'm hoping that David was telling you about how he had really good visual imagery. He could manipulate information. He's a designer and architect, so he can visually manipulate information. And in the next video, I'm going to ask him what is his experience now.
okay? I first became aware of it when I couldn't play within my mind images. I couldn't imagine. I couldn't see stuff. I couldn't see stuff within my. I don't like the term mind's eye, but I couldn't see stuff within my head. Behind, it was just, there was nothing there. It was blank, and no matter how many. In fact, when I would try, I'd actually get physical pain in my head around about here, because I tried to imagine something. And so I would do things like, I'd be sitting in my hospital bed and I'd be looking at something, and then I'd close my eyes, turn away, and try to reimagine what I'd just seen. And there was nothing there. Whereas before, I wouldn't use the term photographic memory, but I could visualize it.
Okay.
Okay,
so hopefully that was the video where David was telling you that now he can't see that stuff that he could so easily manipulate before. So this is just like Adam's patient MX. As you heard, David being an architect and designer, he was extremely good at mentally seeing things and being able to manipulate that, seeing things from different angles, etc. Whereas now he finds it virtually impossible to do the same thing. Okay, now I mentioned earlier that an important aspect of mental imagery is autobiographical memory. So that if I asked you about your last holiday, most people would come up with some sort of mental image, visual image of the places that they went to, and it would almost be like playing a film through their mind's eye of them moving around, arriving somewhere, doing things, etc. So I know that because my PhD many years ago was on autobiographical memory, and we looked at how people remembered things, what they remembered, what the qualities of the memory were, etc. And so, for example, this is a photograph of me 2 Novembers ago in Oman with my wonderful friend Phil, and we'd spent an evening in the desert on a desert trek, and that was when we'd gone out on a sunset walk. And this is an amazing chandelier in the Grand Mosque in Oman. Now, the reason I say this is because just before we'd been, David had been to Oman with his family. So yesterday when I was talking to David about Oman, he wasn't able to give me any real memories of his time there. He could give me some snapshot ideas, but not really any memories that felt like a presence being there. And what you see there is that there can be a link between that memory and the visual replaying of the events that you were part of, and the aphantasia. And if you lose that ability to mentally play back those scenes, then that can affect your memory. Now, just yesterday, I got talking to a young lady on Facebook who lives very close to me because it was on a community page on Facebook. And she said she also has aphantasia, the developmental version. And Billy Ray was happy for me to use a quote that she gave me this morning by email. And she said, I asked her how she remembers her holiday. And she said, when I remember my last holiday, I have the knowledge of where I went. I have photos and I know what places look like, but I can't see any of the landmarks I went to. When I try to remember a day or activity, I think of places as though blocks, such as to the left of me was a building. Then I walked down the road where there was another landmark, which was round. Now, what you see here is Billy Ray has not had brain damage. And yet, like David, she doesn't see those places. She knows she went. David knows that he went to Oman, and he told me things that he remembers seeing, but there isn't that experiential flavor to what he's telling me. Now, really importantly, I see a point that Billy Ray said I thought was really important. She says, when I try to remember a day or activity, I think of places as though blocks, such as to the left of me was building, etc. Now, do you remember I said about the Badley and Hitch model, which separated visual from spatial? There's a sense in what Billy Ray has said that she has a sense of the spatial arrangement of things that she experienced, even though she can't see them. So she knows that there was something there to her left, etc., but she can't actually quite see it. And it will take us time to try to map that properly. But what we're seeing here is that importance of the visual information in giving us a sense of our autobiographical past. Now, a question that will have come up is, what about other senses? And for me, this is really important because we know in psychology research that there's a huge amount of research on our visual understanding and our understanding of verbal information. And that's because those are the ways we communicate so much, but our other senses sometimes get overlooked. So I was keen to find out what David's experiences was. So this is him telling me about a lemon.
I was trying to imagine because I've read about people saying about they can't do this, and it not occurred to me that it wasn't there. And I was trying to think about things. So I was trying to think to myself, what does a lemon taste like? And I know a lemon's sharp, but then I found myself thinking, well, what does a lemon smell like? Well, a lemon smells like a lemon, which is which is like, but what does that actually? And I was thinking, I can't call it up.
So that was him talking about a lemon. I thought I'd move to another thing about taste. There he was talking about smell, etc. And David and I have been known to frequent pubs together. He and I could sort out the meaning of life in pubs. We get on so well. And so I asked him about wine. This isn't David, it's me. What I'm going to ask him about is what wine tastes like for him, or the sensation, and you'll see the experience I feel when I ask him about wine, and let's see how he feels. But I'm trying to get at, if I ask you to imagine a nice glass of red wine, do you get a, I can think, I mean, I'm beginning to salivate right now, thinking of the type of red wine I like.
I know that I enjoy.
Yeah, but I want to know what you're...
Can I know exactly? And that's the difference. And it's just like this trying to separate. And that's the bit that is really, it's been really, for want of a better term, confusing. Because knowing that before, that I could do it, and like suddenly, or I can't do it anymore. And it's like groping around. It's like someone's turned the lights off.
So we see here that something that's so pleasurable, drinking a glass of wine or remembering the glass of wine, because he can still taste the wine when he drinks it, he can't bring that memory up. I have worked with another patient, Anthony, who might be listening as well, who actually lost the ability to smell and taste. So Anthony, who's a great wit, said that that does mean that everything he tastes and smells is the best that he's ever had in his life, because everything just tastes the same and he can just create the sensation in his mind, in his head. But that's when he's actually having the food or the wine. In David's case, he can taste it completely when it's there, but when it's not there, he can't bring it to mind in the same way. So what we see here is that for some people, at least, the lack of that experiential feeling that visual images can give us can also go to the other senses. Now, that brings us to this lovely woman, Nessa, who is my friend's friend in Toronto, and who I'd actually cooked for about 2 years ago when I was visiting Toronto. And when she got the email about the Aphantasia talk, Nessa wrote to me straight away and said, oh my God, now something that I can relate to because I have aphantasia. So here, this is just an interview I did on Wednesday, where Nessa said that she had a vase of flowers in front of her, and I asked her what she can see when she closes her eyes.
It's literally, I close my eyes and all I see is black.
And what about was it your husband, Steve? So yeah. Can you see his face when you close your eyes?
Nothing, nothing. It's fascinating, and yet my capacity to remember is greater than his. And he said, how do you do that?
So you see, she doesn't have that image of the vase that's in front of her, but her memory is actually not bad. And so you see what we call in neuropsychology dissociations, and a difficulty in one thing, but a very strong, possibly a very strong ability in another. So that brings us to the big issue of dreaming. So what happens in dreaming? And you can see her so excited here already. Just such a wonderful woman. I wanted to reach across and just give a big hug. So that will have to wait. But this is when I asked Nessa about her dreaming.
It's a really interesting thing. I have very vivid, very visual dreams.
Okay.
And like that was, I was confused about that at first, because, I thought, and like I can describe the details of my dreams quite visually, but in the waking state, I cannot generate those images. And when I was reading about it, that's not uncommon, that experience of being able to visualize in your dream state, but not in your waking state.
So you see, Nessa said earlier that the vase she can't see, her lovely husband Steve, she couldn't see him when she closed her eyes. And yet when she's dreaming, she can see Steve. So what we see is this weird thing where during dreaming, the eyes are closed, and yet Nessa can see visual images. There are other people who don't see any. So David says that he's completely lost his dreaming since his brain injury. So it's rather complicated. Now, because of Adam talking in 2015 about this phrase, aphantasia, it got picked up by the media, and there were articles in various publications. And as a result of that, lots of people got in touch with Adam, and he did a survey of 2,000 individuals who'd got in touch with him. And what he found is that a third of these people actually also experienced prosopagnosia, so had a difficulty with recognizing faces. So another lovely lady I also spoke to on Wednesday, it's called Ruth, who I talked to on the prosopagnosia group. And Ruth has both prosopagnosia and aphantasia, and she's always had these. Nessa feels that she probably has prosopagnosia as well as aphantasia. We know David has, but 2/3 do not. So there are 2/3 of people with aphantasia who've got no problems with recognizing faces. And in fact, we have started working with a young lady who has got aphantasia, and yet she scores above average on face recognition. So we see there isn't a one-to-one mapping between inability to see visually in your mind's eye and face recognition disorders. Because with that young lady, what we see is that she's not bad with face recognition. She's actually on the cusp of being a super recognizer, which makes things really weird, which gets people like me extremely excited, because when we find people with these interesting combinations, then that allows us to dig really deep into what's happening in the brain. And I don't mean literally, because I'm not a neurosurgeon. A third of these people have got what's referred to as SDAM, or severely deficient autobiographical memory. Now, given what I said earlier about autobiographical memory, you can imagine why this is so. If you can't see that movie reel in your mind's eye about your experiences, it may affect your ability to remember things. But again, 2/3 of people with aphantasia don't have a deficient autobiographical memory. So David and I can have really lovely conversations about the previous times we've met. It's just that the flavor of his memories will be different to mine. Doesn't mean that they're bad, they're just different. I mentioned earlier that we use mental imagery for reading. Well, many people with aphantasia can't enjoy fiction with lengthy passages which have highly visually imaginable scenes. And that makes sense. If you need to think about those buildings, those hills, that person there wearing this thing, etc., then it becomes rather difficult. I know that people with developmental prosopagnosia, but also people with acquired prosopagnosia, find watching films really difficult because they can't recognize this thing. What they tend to be using is this thing, the clothes and things like that people are wearing to try to track from one scene to another. But in a film, unless someone is wearing the same clothes in every scene, they change the clothes. And the result is that the clue that they're using to compensate for this not helping them is changing all the time. So just in the same way as people with prosopagnosia find watching films tricky because of the changing clothes, etc., so people with aphantasia also find it difficult with these reading things that require them to create visual images. As I've shown with Nessa, half of the people with aphantasia cannot dream visually. Half have a multimodal lack of imagery, so it's not just visual, so similar to what I showed with David with the lemon and the glass of red wine. However, there are lots of artists and writers with aphantasia. So what I want to make clear here is that while some people with aphantasia might have difficulties in some realms, that it's certainly not some sort of disability. And indeed, there are creative people who have got aphantasia. So it doesn't mean that aphantasia has to be linked with a lack of creativity. And intriguingly, many people in the creative industries. Now, some of you, you're being able to watch my talk to this young man called Blake Ross, who is the founder of Firefox. So Blake Ross founded Firefox, and he was also a director of product at Facebook. Apparently, there are other people at Facebook who also have aphantasia, and apparently quite a few people at Pixar that creates those fantastic animations are aphantasic. So what we have here is this intriguing thing where you would think that not having that visual image might have an impact, but it doesn't seem to. So again, that there isn't a one-to-one mapping between an inability in that mind's eye and the ability to actually use that skill. Of course, it's complicated, and as I said earlier, we're only understanding it now. Apparently, the man, and I've forgotten his name, who was the first to decode the human genome, is aphantasic, and he joked that at least his mind isn't cluttered with all the other rubbish that people tend to have in their mind's eye. So in a way, it was an advantage to not have the everyday images. So in my neurodiversity talk, I talked about an Oxford physiologist who's been looking at dyslexia. And intriguingly, this physiologist said that dyslexia shouldn't be seen as a disability, because he's beginning to show that people with dyslexia, they're not just better at non-reading things, which would be a relative better, so poor on reading but better on other things such as visual things. They're actually better than average. And so what he suggests is that maybe at a genetic level, there's a weakness in one aspect of cognition, our mental abilities, but that's because of a strength in a different area. Now, again, very new, it's a new area, so it's difficult to tell. But what we're seeing here is that you can be aphantasic and be highly creative, and people who work in the technical world can do this. So there is possibly a strength that is compensating for the weakness in the aphantasia. So coming to those individual differences that I talked about, Darwin, Galton's cousin, was the one who started that inquiry into individual differences. And this is just from my neurodiversity talk to say there's no such thing as normal. What does it mean? And the great Whoopi Goldberg said that normal is nothing more than a cycle on a washing machine. So I think it's important that we don't see people with aphantasia as being abnormal, because they're not. They're just different, and they've got strengths and weaknesses, and we're all like that. We're not all the same. We all fall on this bell-shaped curve where some of us are in the middle. So in terms of height, boringly average. There are some people who are taller than me, some people who are shorter than me. And in other things, we're different, and we all have strengths and weaknesses. So if we take this bell-shaped curve for me, if we talked about the brain, I would probably be score higher than average on my knowledge of the brain, which is why I'm talking to you about the brain. And that's me holding a little baby replica of my brain. It's a 3D printed copy of my brain. We talked about cooking. I'm pretty good at cooking, and I'm getting better during lockdown. And I would say I'm on the right-hand side of middle. So I'm better than average, but I'm certainly not going to be on MasterChef or opening a restaurant. Some of you know that I sing, and this is me with some of the basses at my wonderful choir, the London City Voices, our 70s concert. And I'm average. I'm never going to be a soloist, but I'm not rubbish either. So I'm average. Here's my darling psychosexual family, who I know from the choir as well. I'm really rubbish at some things, and one of those is driving. So don't ever give me the keys to a car. It's better if I give you money for a taxi. So just like someone with aphantasia who might be weaker on one thing, they can have strength in other as well. So I think it's really important that we think about that when we consider someone who's weak on something. That doesn't need to be a label on everything. Finally, I want to come to terminology, and that's whether aphantasia is the correct term. Now, earlier I showed you David and the lemon and the red wine, and we saw that those are not visual things, and yet there's something about aphantasia which I thought maybe is just visual, but I wasn't sure. So I consulted an expert, and my expert happens to be Dr. Maria Notara, who is Greek. She knows ancient Greek very well, and she's a neuropsychologist. And this is what she said. She says, Fantasia, or however the Greek would be, is imagination, and it revolves around the image rather than the sensation or experience. Somebody who has no fantasia lacks the ability to imagine a plan, come up with creative solution, etc. So this is rather interesting, because aphantasia would therefore imply that people with aphantasia can't imagine at all. They've got no imagination. They can't imagine a plan. They can't be creative, etc. And that is specifically what I've been told is not the case. People we've just seen, people with aphantasia can be very creative. So it might be that Adam landed on the wrong Greek root there. Now, I know Adam, so I only thought about this yesterday. So this is all fresh for me as well. These ideas are less than 24 hours. So there was a lot of WhatsApping with Maria. So I'm actually going to get in touch with Adam and tell him what I think. So let's see what I think. A new taxonomy. Now, Maria and I discussed this. She said that the Greek root morphe is for an image or a presence, which is not necessarily a visual image. So anything that is a presence of something, a form of some type. And amorphia would be an inability to form that image. So using the Greek roots for the different senses, I've come up with these terms, which is optic amorphia, which is the inability to form a visual image, which is what up till now has been referred to as aphantasia. Echoemorphia, which is the inability to form an auditory image. So me thinking of Dancing Queen and how Dancing Queen goes right now would be me creating an auditory image. And if someone can't create that auditory image, like an earworm, then that I would say is echoemorphia. Osmeomorphia is the inability to form an olfactory image, so the scent of someone or a perfume or something like that. Haptoemorphia would be inability to form a tactile image, so the touch or pressure of something. And then the most difficult one, it took us a while to come up with this, is Gevsisomorphia, which is the inability to form a gustatory image, such as the taste of that wine. So finally, or almost finally, I want to talk to you about overlaps. The fact that we can have aphantasia, but as we saw with Adam's survey of 2,000 people, we can have some of those also have prosopagnosia. But we also know that some of them have got synesthesia and we can have people with aphantasia who might have synesthesia or not, but we certainly do have people who are prosopagnosic who also have synesthesia. And those of you who haven't heard of synesthesia, that is multisensory perception, where someone can think of the letter A and have a color associated with it, or they can think of the number 7 and it's got a color. They can think of space, or sorry, time, such as the months of the year or even years, in a physical space around them. There are people who taste words, etc. So synesthesia is a blending of the senses. And so what we want to look at is, what is the overlap between these things and why does that occur? So finally, an attempted synthesis, and this is 24 hours old, so please forgive me. And I was up till 2 a.m. For an international committee meeting, so I'm rather tired, so please forgive me if I screw this up. So we've got our 5 senses: our smell, our hearing, our vision, our touch, and our taste. And if we take vision, for example, going via the Baddeley and Hitch model, working memory, we can have a visual aspect to it and a spatial aspect. And we saw that with Billy Ray's description of a memory, that she had a spatial element to it, but not a visual one. Then we know that the visual image can be compromised, resulting in levels of developmental aphantasia. We also know that it can be acquired, such as in the case of David. We also know, and I didn't have time to talk about this, that there are people who've got extremely strong imagery, and these are people who've got hyperphantasia, or and we also know that they can be extremely good in memory. Then looking at the aphantasia, either with the developmental or the acquired, we know that there can be something with the mind's eye, so whether or not you can see the vase when your eyes are closed, or whether you can see something when you're dreaming. And what we saw was a dissociation in Nessa's case, where she can't see Steve when she closes her eyes, and yet she can see Steve when she's dreaming. So we see all these differences. So what I'd like to suggest is that if you lose the ability to have that visual image through the olfactory sense, then we call that osmemorphia. If you lose it through the auditory sense, it's echoemorphia. Through the visual sense, it's opticomorphia. Through touch, haptoemorphia. And then through taste, gifsimorphia. So as a summary, what I hope I've shown you is that sensory experiences are very complex. Visual imagery is important for a number of different everyday skills that we take for granted. And some people lose these abilities due to brain damage, and that's extremely rare. But there are some people who've always had this difficulty, and that's about 2% of the population. So 1 in 50. So I know there's about 250 people who'd signed up for this talk. I don't know how many are actually on the chat, but that would imply that there's about 10 people out there on average who have got aphantasia, and that would just be from a regular random sample, but I know that there might be people who are watching this because they know they've got it. However, it's not a disability, and sometimes there are strengths. And then finally, understanding the condition, how it links to other cognitive abilities, etc., will help us understand overall brain functions better. So what we want to do in the aphantasia research group at ART, myself and Claudia, is that we want to look at replicating the prevalence studies. So is that 2% accurate? And this happened with the synesthesia world as well, that the prevalence changed as more research was done. We want to compare individuals like David who've got acquired aphantasia with developmental people of the developmental version, such as Billy Ray and Nessa. I also want to address heterogeneity within the condition. So I mean differences. So severity, because not every aphantasia, not every person with optic amorphia will have the same severity. Some will have it really badly and others will have it mildly. I also want to look at the sensory modalities that are affected, because you saw from Adam's results that half of the people had all of their modalities affected and others didn't. Are there patterns of which ones are affected or not? Then I want to link to other conditions, prosopagnosia, etc. Importantly, as a cognitive neuropsychologist, I want to understand why. What's going on here? So going back to things like Pavio's model, etc. Then finally, looking at the strengths and to develop public awareness can help us impact some educational practices, because a lot of children are taught to use visual mind maps, for example, for their learning. If a child can't do that, then it's not their fault. So we have to take that into consideration and help them. And then what is the impact about these taken for granted abilities? So for example, Ruth was telling me about meditation practices as a Quaker, where you're expected to think about a particular visual scene and Christ talking to you, etc. And she said that it's really difficult for her to imagine visually those things, which then get in the way of that meditation she's doing. And in some forms of therapy, people are asked to create visual images of things to try to deal with a phobia or something like that. So by having taken these things for granted, we might be marginalizing the ability of some of these practices for individuals like that. Okay, so finally, I just want to say that if you'd like to take part in our future research, not just in this area, we work in prosopagnosia, in amnesia, memory disorders, and dementia, please email us to art.gold.mind@gmail.com. And if you can, include your name, age, gender, and if you do have a neurological condition such as epilepsy or a cognitive difficulty, or even a strength, if you think you're exceptionally good with face memory or with visual imagery, then we'd like to know about it. And you can find out more about our team at our website, which is gold.ac.uk Art Lab. Okay, so thank you very much. Now, in the feedback, when I asked what would you like more of, one of the bits of feedback was more pictures of the family. Now, I started with a photograph from my birthday last year, and this is a photograph from my mother's birthday in December. And so that's for those people who asked for some pictures of my mummy. So thank you very much. I'm now going to quickly have the pee break, and I know questions have been coming in. I'm sorry that the talk has been long, but I hope that it's been for a good reason. So I'm just going to turn the camera off and my audio, and I'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay, I'm back and relieved, as it were. So I've got some lovely questions here. I'm going to try to answer the questions which I think have broadest appeal. If they're too technical, which I think that are more better for one-to-one communication, then I'll skip them. Okay, so the first question was from Kai Holmes, and Kai asked, does the mind's eye always have to be visual? And hopefully, Kai, my answer regarding the other senses answered that, because it's a classic thing. As I said, a lot of research in behavioral psychology tends to be about visual and auditory things, and hence the term mind's eye, but we also have the mind's ear, etc. So I hope that answered your question. Okay, Janet Cawthorne asked, I wonder how aphantasia relates to dreaming. So I hope I answered that question, that some people with aphantasia cannot dream and others still can. Kai has asked, I wonder how babies with aphantasia deal with object permanence. That's a very interesting question, Kai. So those of you who don't know psychology, object permanence is a really important concept, which is effectively out of sight, out of mind. So when I show you this, when I take it away, you know that glass still exists. Now, there is a developmental point at which children learn this, or babies learn this. And that is where they are understanding that the world has a reality and a permanence, and that it's not just about these 2 seconds, that there's something that happened before which still exists. So a baby that can't keep that visual image, I don't know how, what would happen, but I imagine that they develop the object permanence in other ways, because I'm also holding this glass. But it's an interesting one, and this sometimes becomes a chicken and egg question, that how can you work out if a baby has got aphantasia or optic amorphia, and how do you, if you can work that out, then yes, you can do the object permanence studies. But given that it's very difficult to do that, work out whether someone's got optic amorphia, because there are people who are watching this who've suddenly said, oh my God, that's me. I didn't realize that I didn't have that. Nessa said that she only found out that she had this condition when she heard something on the radio or TV, and she wasn't 2 years old when that happened. I think she was a bit older. So I think it's one of those circular questions that's going to take us a while to sort out. Rebecca Paz, Dr. Rebecca Paz, a clinical neuropsychologist, has asked, do you think there is a relationship between multisensory imagery and capacity to empathize? I think that's a really interesting question, because what Rebecca is asking here is, multisensory imagery, that ability to imagine the smell, the taste, etc., that's really important for getting into someone else's experience, which is empathy. So Rebecca is asking whether that inability to play back in your own world, in your mind, what someone is telling you about the taste, the smell, etc. of things, does that compromise their ability to actually get emotionally into someone else's world? I think that's a good research question. So Rebecca, I think we should collaborate on this, okay? So thank you for that invitation to collaborate. Rosie Ball has asked, and those with synesthesia have a very heightened ability. Would there be a link, an additional ability to visualize but not voluntary? I don't quite understand your question, Rosie. In terms of the synesthesia, I didn't make it clear, because I knew that I was running over time, that synesthesia is completely involuntary. When you say the word Monday, they don't think about what color it is. It is blue or pink, and every synesthete, it's a different color for them. And if you show them the word Monday on a screen, for some of them, they see the yellow there without even thinking about it. So I'm not, do send your question in again, because I don't quite get it from the way it's worded at the moment. Okay. Has this impact validity of IQ tests when you have to rotate cubes in space? That's a really good question, Rosie, again, because IQ tests are created on the assumption that we can all verbally remember, that we can count, we can add up. And one of them is a visuospatial task involving rotating images and saying, is A the same as B? And Rosie's question is really nice, because this is one of those taking for granted issues, because it's taken for granted that our cognition, our intellectual abilities, involves all of these different things, because most of us have them, but most of us is not 100%. So that's a really nice question, Rosie. Thank you for that. And I'd quite like to chase that one up, actually. I think this is Bell Har asks, if I cannot see a mental image when thinking of a horse, but I know what one looks like cognitively, do I have a mind's eye or do I have aphantasia? It's difficult to tell, Bell, but from what you say, I would say that you've got what I would refer to as optic amorphia, because the knowledge of what one looks like, that is what Alan Pavio and people around that time would call propositional knowledge. Like, I have the knowledge that a car has got, usually has 4 wheels and either 2 doors or 4 or 5 or etc., and a number of windows, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm thinking of a particular car. So I think that from what you've described, that you can't see that mental image. So if when you close your eyes, you don't actually see that horse, and if I said to you, give that horse green wings and give it pink leggings, etc., if you can't do that, then that would suggest that you've got what I would call optic amorphia. Okay. Fred, I think it's Chunga, asks, what do you mean about difference of visual and spatial? What I mean is that right now, I can see my visual field goes like this. And if I close my eyes, I could describe to you that the things that I know are there, because I know that the laptop, I could bring it to mind. I can bring to mind the fireplace, the lamp that I've had to put up above the laptop so you can see me, and also a bookcase or the display cabinet. Now, that's me telling you the images. I didn't tell you where they are, but the fireplace is very much there. The lamp is over there. The laptop is there, and the bookcase thing is there. So I've got a spatial sense of what those things are, as well as a visual sense. And from what Billy Ray said, she said that she knew that something was to the left, even if she couldn't actually quite see it. So that's why I mean a visual and a spatial form of information. And there is research that's demonstrated that just in Joe Bloggs and everyone, those two things do separate out. I don't know whether this is Nessa asking a question, but I guess visualizing in a dream versus waking state are two different things, in that one is creating rather than remembering. Yes, because when you're dreaming, you are playing something and creating it. But actually, I think that's Janet Cawthorne's question. I think you're wrong there, because even when Nessa can't see something when she closes her eyes, it's not just the vase that's in front of her. Just as I said to Belle, seeing a horse and then imagining it with green wings and putting pink leggings on its legs, etc. That's not remembering. That's creating. So I think that analogy with dreaming isn't quite correct. Okay. Deborah Gomer has asked, what studies are there with visually impaired people? There will be lots of studies, Deborah, with visually impaired people, but I don't know them, I'm afraid. I think the thing about visual impairment is that it's a peripheral problem. Oh, well, problems can happen in the visual sense in lots of different ways. So there can be something wrong with the eyeball itself. There can be something wrong with the screen at the back of the eyeball, which is called the retina, which takes all of the information that's coming in. And then that information is sent to the back of the brain, and then difficulties can happen there. Now, if there's a problem in the retina, that's called a peripheral problem. Whereas if it happens here in the brain because of damage here, that's called a cortical problem. So when the input to the system is impaired, because the retina or the eyeball have got problems. You're never going to get 100% input into the brain anyway. So visual impairment, it depends on what you're referring to, because the types of people like David, who has the prosopagnosia, or a patient that I've worked with called Philip, who has prosopagnosia, but he also has difficulty recognizing everyday animals and things like that. So his problem isn't just for faces. He has problems with recognizing all sorts of visual objects. His eyes work fine. So all of this apparatus is okay. There's something here. So it kind of depends on how you're defining visual impairment. But as I said, I don't know a lot about that area. Sabrina Frone has asked, if people can't dream visually, can they, or do they dream with different senses or not at all? I think the impression I get is that they have dreams, just like Billy Ray can remember her holiday. It doesn't have a visual sense to it. And so I think what this calls for is effectively an analysis of dreams, of what are those dreams. I think one of the difficulties is about the fact that dreaming is so complex anyway. So some of us can remember a dream, some of us can't. So that's even without the aphantasia or optic amorphia or whatever involved. So trying to get a handle on what is the quality of the dream is quite difficult. But I imagine that there are people who do that sort of analysis and look at the quality of dreams. So I think an interesting thing, and Claudia, you can make a note of this, is that we can look at the dream literature and try to look at what is it that Nessa is experiencing, what is it that David is experiencing, because it's not that they're out for the count for 7 hours or 8 hours and nothing happens. It's that they don't have a visual element to their dream. But then, as I said, there are people like Nessa, of course, who do dream. So it's a very complex issue at a number of different levels. Let's see, who was next? Oh God, there's so many questions. So Fred Chung has asked, does a scale of Fantasia exist? Yes, because that's what I meant about heterogeneity and severity. It's not a binary thing that you have it or you don't have it. There'll be people watching this who have aphantasia or optic amorphia who are much worse than others. And so what we would do is to do tests where we ask them for ratings of how vivid their images are, and then we'd get a score for each person. So yes, there will be scales. Okay. Dr. Rebecca Pozzo asks, does the multimodal lack of imagery extend to physiological and emotional imagery, i.e. being able to imagine how I might feel if I was standing on a precipice? I don't know. Interesting question. Maybe David or Nessa can answer that question. That do you get an emotional sense from that as well? Janet, your questions are rather complex, and I'm not sure, I can't answer all of these in this space. But one of Janet's questions is, do you think there is a potential for plasticity with aphantasia? So for example, would some kind of cognitive training or practice have an effect? Not really, but that's an intuition. Because the people I know who've got developmental prosopagnosia, however hard they try, they can't then remember a face. And that plus the plasticity would suggest that you can make that change, but at the moment there isn't, so I don't think so. Okay, who is next? So this one's a long one, so I'll just take a a sip. So not a question, but comment. So Mandy Wood, who runs a great Facebook group for teachers or students of psychology, said, my dad is a visual artist and teaches life drawing, in fact, to animation students. He always says that when people who draw what they actually see rather than what they think they see or rely on schema knowledge end up creating more accurate and often more interesting drawings. This is linked to what you're saying, Ashok, as those who cannot bring up visual images are forced to rely on the reality, not the memory. Hence, they should be more talented artists. That's a really, 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 really lovely question, Mandy, and it's actually an interesting point there. So what Mandy said is that her dad, his teacher, who's a visual artist and teaches life drawings, the people who are drawing what they see are better and more creative than the ones who are drawing from their memory. And the latter are using what we call schemas. They're not drawing this glass, they're drawing their idea of glassness. And that's really important, because if I'm asking you to draw this glass, I don't want you drawing your glass in your head. I want you to draw this glass. Interestingly, that dovetails into what Barbara, the artist, said to me. She said that in her training, she's Canadian, moved to the UK. In her training in Canada at art school, they were told to deliberately break down an object into its constituent parts and even draw things upside down. Now, most people, if you ask them to draw a chair, they'll draw an upright chair with the four legs and the back, etc. Now, they're using their idea of a chair, but if you turn the chair upside down, they find it more difficult to draw that chair because they can't use their schema, which is their idealized idea of chairs, to draw the chair in front of them. And so what Mandy is saying is that her father finds that people who are actually drawing this particular chair or this particular glass, they're much better artists and more creative than the ones who are using this thing here. So they look at this glass and then they discount that image and they draw their glass. And that's a really interesting point because it dovetails, as I said, into Barbara's experiences as a portrait painter. Okay. Ruth. Ruth, who I talked about, who told me about her experience with the meditation as a Quaker. She said, I think we need to add the sixth sense of proprioception. I can't imagine my body moving in space, e.g. I can't imagine my Tai Chi routine unless I actually do it. Oh yes, I'm so sorry, Ruth. I had such a lovely conversation with Ruth on Wednesday, and she was telling me how, and this is why I mentioned the imagery and practice, etc., because Ruth is saying that in her Tai Chi classes, she finds it difficult to imagine those movements, and in playing the guitar, those imagined movements. So what she's saying here is that she can't imagine her body moving in space. So she actually has to physically do her Tai Chi movements. And this links into sports athletes, especially elite athletes. They use a lot of mental imagery. Their coaches train them now, because they now know that there's a lot of sport psychology involved in sport, to actually imagine the different stages of a 10-second sprint, 100 meters, to imagine the different phases of the race. So can you imagine an elite athlete who couldn't do that? They probably wouldn't get to elite status, because if that imagery helps people get that extra 500ths of a second, then the person who can't imagine might not be able to get to the elite status. So thank you for that, Ruth. Okay, God, so many questions. This is really lovely. Dave Alsop, who I was at university with, asked, longer is normally no problem for me, but just in case people are pushed for time, would you maybe put slide numbers N of N at the bottom so we know if we can hang on until then? Yes, thank you, Dave. I'll try to do that just so I know. And this talk, because it was a completely new one, I didn't know where I was going. So Claudia or one of the team, can you remind me about that? Jonathan Gossage, who I think is from Canada, said that I feel that your terminology description should deal with the case where there is no sensory recall, but there may be a strong ability to form verbally based descriptions. I disagree because the verbally based descriptions would be kind of like what Belle said, that she knows what a horse is. She might not have that visual image, but she knows what a horse is, which is what I would say that the cognitive psychologists, the early cognitive psychologists would say was propositional knowledge. I'm talking about the actual experience of that smell or that taste, etc. So I think that the term still stands. Patsy Ann Jones has asked, I wondered if there was a strong correlation between do you mean aphantasia and PTSD? I have no idea. There have been some links drawn between some emotional difficulties and some aspects of aphantasia, but I'm really quite wary about going there, because although Cotard first talked about that psychiatric link, and in fact, I didn't show the data here because I wanted to stay away from that area. But Adam's data showed that there is a proportion of people with aphantasia who have got some difficulties in some mental health spheres. I didn't want to go there because sometimes it's just what we would call an illusory conjunction, that a proportion of left-handed people will also be blue-eyed, but that doesn't mean that left-handedness and blue-eyedness go together. So I wanted to stay away from those negative connotations, because I think that you'll always find a number that X% of these people also have Y, but whether that's there's a reality to it or whether it's just pure chance is a separate thing. So I think I'll veer away from that. And Mandy Wood has said this would start to explain some of the features of autism, i.e. that the social aspects relating to theory of mind or empathizing are a consequence of differences in memory. In fact, again, in Adam's data, there was a link between or a certain number of those 2,000 people also had Asperger's. Now, again, part of that is whether that those 2,000 people were representative or not. And this is where prevalent studies, like what I suggested earlier, are needed so that we can get a really large enough sample rather than just people who are answering an advert because they're interested in something. Because by virtue of them being interested in a topic, they might be self-selected. So I think that we need to kind of hold back on some of those connections with disorders. So I want to try to stay away from that. In years to come, we might find that there is a link for some people. Whether they go hand in hand is a separate thing. So Catherine Staley, I think, says, my friend sees the word table in her mind when asked to imagine a table. Is that synesthesia? If she actually sees the word table when asked to imagine a table, that's really interesting. Get your friend to get in touch with me, Catherine, because, if I tell someone to think of a cat and they see the letters CAT, is that synesthesia? It's not synesthesia, but it's something else. Synesthesia is multisensory perception. So if for some people, if you said the word table, they might have a taste of cheese. Completely unconnected, completely unconnected. There's no one-to-one mapping. Whereas seeing the word table because of hearing the or being asked to think of the object table, that is a separate thing, but I'm not sure what it is. Okay, so Rosie Ball says, with the synesthesia question, I meant that some of us can voluntarily imagine an image, and those with synesthesia involuntarily have a visual image and it is heightened. So those with synesthesia have a heightened ability, and those with aphantasia have a deficit of this ability. Are they of opposite ends of the spectrum? No, they're not. The opposite end is hyperphantasia. I haven't yet talked to someone with that. Synesthesia is an additional sense. The optic amorphia that I want to call it is a reduced sense in that one sense. And as we've seen, some people with these conditions are completely fine in the other senses anyway. Whereas with synesthesia, it's hearing something and seeing a color, which is the mixing of two senses. So I think that they are two different things. So Mandy says, how do hyperphantasia link it with maladaptive? I have no idea. I don't know about maladaptive dreaming disorder, I'm afraid. Okay. So Janet has come back and said she may have phrased her idea incorrectly. She apologizes. I just meant to distinguish dreaming from being asked to visualize something specific. For example, for people who do dream visually but can't visualize specifics that they've been asked to. Yes, of course they're different. So I wasn't trying to suggest that Nessa not being able to see that vase when she closed her eyes didn't make sense, given that she can dream. I was saying that it demonstrates that something that on the surface looks visual can be very different. So that was the only thing I was saying there. Fred, I'm afraid that I don't know whether there's a male-female difference in aphantasia. Again, this is where we need to do more research. And I have no idea about the hallucinogenic drugs. It may be that hallucinogenic drugs I doubt whether hallucinogenic drugs are going to produce images for people with optic amorphia. But if there's anyone there with what used to be called aphantasia, but is now being rebranded as optic amorphia, and you have taken hallucinogenic drugs, then please get in touch with me, because I'd like to know about your experiences. And then Rosie Ball asked, does this all link to mirror neurons? Mirror neurons are a really intriguing finding to explain to us how we understand what someone else is doing. And a simple example is that if I do this, the idea is that somewhere there's a theater in your head that sees that movement and works out what's happening there. And you play through this theater, which uses these guys called mirror neurons. You play this in your little theater of you doing that. So you don't actually do it, but your little theater pretends to do that and then says, oh, that feels like when I lift my arm. And then you know, because you now understand that this feeling in your head tells you that's like you lifting your arm, that I'm lifting my arm. So if I smile, then what happens is that your little theater through your mirror neuron guys, it does this movement in, it's difficult to do a spontaneous smile. Now I'm doing it properly. Your mirror neurons will replay those visual movements or those facial movements. And then because up here, you will understand, oh, when I'm like that's me smiling and I'm happy, you'll now know that I'm happy. So that's what these mirror neurons are about. And linking to Mandy's question, there were suggestions that was one of the difficulties in autism. Now, I don't work in autism, so I don't want to make a claim about that. It used to be an idea, but we don't know. So, Rosie, I'm afraid I don't know, but I don't think that the optic amorphia has got anything to do with mirror neurons. I think it's literally about whether you can create that image for yourself, whether that apparatus or the processes are impaired. Okay. So Janet, she's on fire, aren't you, Janet? She's asked whether hyperphantasia is linked to what people mean by photographic memory. I think that's where they're moving with hyperphantasia, that it's those very vivid visual memories. And there is a claim that children have what's called eidetic memory, which is like photographic memory. But we lose that as we get older. Interestingly, this links in with Mandy's question, because I think what happens is that when we're children, after we've learned that object permanence, which links to Kai's question, I'm good with remembering who asked what. After, as babies and as toddlers, when we've understood the permanence of objects in the world, you don't need to remember this glass, because when it's gone, you know that there's a glass. But then, are you remembering this glass or any glass? Maybe you're remembering any glass. Now, apparently, the idea is that as we become more verbal as children, and I don't mean, talking back, I mean being able to describe the world more verbally and being able to articulate things and say things, etc., we don't rely as much on our visual senses. And I think that this is why drawing therapy and stuff like that is used with young kids. And I'm really going out on a limb there, but I'm assuming this, that because children might not be able to express themselves verbally, they're asked to draw things, especially with trauma and things like that, because they don't have that verbal apparatus yet. But when the verbal apparatus has happened, you kind of see this, oh, that's a glass. Okay, I remember there's a glass. And then you remember glassness. And so the suggestion is that as we lose that eidetic memory because we become verbal, we start relying more and more on our schematic knowledge, which is what Mandy was saying about her father teaching these painters, that the ones who rely on just their chair in here rather than the chair that's out there, they're relying on that schema. And maybe those good painters in Mandy's dad's class, they're actually the ones who are using their photographs in front of them, so their photographic memory, rather than the image in their mind's eye. So I think that what we're seeing is coming together of some of these issues to do with a particular skill during childhood that's going because we've become such a verbal species, and we can describe what we're seeing. So we don't rely on the visual as much because we've stored it as a verbal code. We abstract some sort of idea of it, which is called the schema, but we don't save all of those bits of detail. And as we get older, we're relying more and more of those ideas of what we think we saw rather than what actually happened. But given that individual differences thing, and the fact that there are some people who not because of any brain damage or any special wiring, they're just better than others, just like some people run faster than others. There's some people who've got that very heightened visual acuity or visual memory, and that stays with them through life. And those people might be the ones who, as children, didn't lose that eidetic memory. So that was me creating a theory out of thin air, and I hope that you were convinced by it. That was the last question I've got here, so I'm just going to wait for a couple of minutes and see if there are any more questions. So I'm going to wait. Maybe everyone's gone. It's fine. 7 o'clock, which is when I felt that things would end up. So we had something like an hour's worth of talk and like 40 minutes of questions. So we've done rather well. So I'm just waiting for an okay from the team to say whether we can call it a day or not. Frankly, I have no idea whether people with aphantasia make poor witnesses because no one's done that research. There have only been. Did Nessa ask that? Nessa, I don't know, I'm afraid, because these are all really lovely questions. And as I said, there have only been 10 or 12 papers in the field. And a lot of the questions that people have been asking me have been really lovely hypothetical questions, but they're ones that we need to find out about. So all I can do is speculate, but I would imagine that that someone with optic amorphia would be a poor eyewitness because we're asking them to remember that visual scene, which they can't. Just like we think that people with poor face recognition or prosopagnosia should not be part doing a line-up parade and trying to work out who did it. So yes, there are issues there. Mandy's asked the lack of synaptic pruning guys, these questions are coming in an odd way. So I don't know whether Mandy's asking Janet or asking me or it's linked to something else. So I'm going to just skip that synaptic pruning question, I'm afraid. You've got to send them in a coherent way. So Janet has said, my son mentioned to me recently the idea of it always being possible to look at an object and instinctively know what it would feel like on the tongue, despite never having had that experience, e.g. wet concrete, a lamppost, Hessian mat, etc. In terms of texture, temperature, etc. I've startled by the seeming plausibility of this. Is it a mental tactile ability rather than mental imagery? No idea. Maybe it depends on how old he is, but I wonder whether that's actually a form of hypergepsismorphia, which I've just made up. So it's taste related. It's a gepsis, morphia rather than amorphia, and hyper as in more. So hypergepsismorphia, like the Aphantasia people or hyper or optic amorphia people, there's heightened visual imagery, and here maybe your son has that ability to taste things, that imagine things that he hasn't experienced. So that sounds rather interesting. So maybe he should be sent to us for research. Okay, I'm see if there are any more questions. I'm not seeing any more. Right. No, thank you, Claudia. Well, thank you to the team for taking all the questions. Thank you to all of you for however many people are left, even if it's only 2 of you. Thank you for listening in. I hope questions, the talk itself was interesting, and I hope my answer session was also useful. We're working out what the next talk will be. It may be actually on synesthesia. I'm still deciding, but I will get back to you and I'll be advertising it through Facebook, etc. as soon as I can. So thank you very much for coming along. Apologies for any technical problems at the beginning. And thank you to the people who've contributed. So that's David, Nessa, Ruth, and Billy Ray. Thank you for sharing your experiences with me so that I can share them with other people. I hope that the people have found them illuminating. Thank you very much. Bye.